9:30 in the morning, a conference room in a Pittsburgh power plant, and the man in the pressed white shirt told Walter Kowalski that 41 years of listening to a turbine was no longer worth anything to the company. Walter said one word, "All right," packed his tools and walked out into the cold. 6 weeks later, that same turbine was leaking $1 million a day, and a room full of engineers and consultants could not tell them why. The answer was a piece of metal so small a man's thumb would cover it, sitting where nobody thought to look. And by the time they found it, they had already lost something they could never buy back. The last morning of Walter Kowalski's 41 years at the Monongahela River Generating Station started the same way the first one had, back in the summer of 1983, with a black coffee from the pot in the millwright's shop, and the low, steady hum of turbine number 3 coming up through the concrete floor into the soles of his boots. He knew that hum the way a mother knows the breathing of a sleeping child. He could tell you, without looking at a single gauge, whether the bearings were running warm, whether the rotor was true, whether the steam was coming in dry or wet from the boilers upstream. 41 years is a long time to listen to one machine, long enough that the man and the machine start to speak the same language, and the man forgets sometimes that no one else in the building can hear what he hears. Walter was 63 that January morning, a broad-shouldered man in dark green coveralls, his forearms marked here and there with the small pale scars of a lifetime spent among hot metal. His hair was iron grey and cropped close. His hands were the hands of his trade, thick-knuckled, wide across the palm, permanently stained a faint grey at the creases. From decades of graphite and oil, no soap could ever quite reach. He had come up in the mill town south of Pittsburgh, the son of a Polish steelworker who had believed a man's words ought to weigh at least as much as his work, and Walter had inherited the belief along with the surname. He was scheduled to retire in 11 months. Margaret, his wife, had already started circling brochures for a fishing cabin up near Tionesta, where his brother-in-law kept a boat. What Walter wanted, mostly, was to finish out his time with the same quiet competence he had brought to it every day for 4 decades, and to walk out the gate on his last shift with his tools in a box under his arm, the way his father had walked out of Homestead Works in 1986. He did not know, when he poured that morning's coffee, that his last shift was 3 hours away. The plant was owned now by a company called Keystone Meridian Energy, which had bought it 18 months earlier from the old utility. They had brought with them a young plant manager, Douglas Brenner, 34 years old with an MBA from a school in Philadelphia, who had never, so far as Walter could tell, actually turned a wrench in his life. Brenner walked the floor in a pressed white shirt and khakis, tablet under his arm, and he had a way of looking at the older men that made Walter think of a man appraising used furniture. The meeting was at 9:30 in the small conference room off the main office. Frank Delaney, the union steward, was there, a compact, wiry man about Walter's age, with a face weathered like a catcher's mitt. And Brenner sat across the table with a folder in front of him, and there was a woman from Human Resources whose name Walter would not remember an hour later. "Walter," Brenner said, and he tried for a warm smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "First off, thank you. 41 years. That is a remarkable tenure, truly." Walter said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that when a man in a clean shirt starts a conversation with "thank you," the next word is generally going to be an unpleasant one. "As part of our modernization initiative," Brenner went on, opening the folder, "we're consolidating some of the senior millwright positions and bringing in a predictive analytics platform, sensors, AI diagnostics. It's where the industry is going. What that means for you is that we're offering an early separation package. Effective end of shift today, 6-month salary, full pension vesting acceleration, medical continuation through the year." Frank Delaney's jaw had gone tight. "You're firing him," Frank said flatly. "We're offering a package. It's very generous. The alternative is he works the 11 months he's got left and walks out with his dignity," Frank said, "which is what a man who gave you 41 years is entitled to." Brenner's smile thinned. "Frank, with respect, the days when a plant could carry redundant labor because of tenure are over. The turbines don't care how long someone has been here. What they need is real-time monitoring, and Mr. Kowalski's skill set, while valuable historically, isn't aligned with where the facility is going." Walter had not spoken. He was looking at Douglas Brenner with the flat, patient attention of a man watching a small animal do something foolish. And he was thinking, very clearly, about turbine number 3 3 floors below them, and about the faint irregularity he had heard in its hum for the last 2 mornings. A small hesitation at the top of the rotation, so slight that he had not yet mentioned it to anyone, because he had wanted to listen one more day to be sure. He was thinking that he would have brought it up this morning to Henry Vaughan on the shop floor. He was thinking that he now would not. He set his coffee cup down on the conference table. He looked once at Frank and gave him a small nod that said, "Let it go. I don't want a fight." And then he looked at Douglas Brenner. "All right," Walter said quietly. "I'll clean out my locker." That was all he said. He stood up and walked out of the conference room, and he went down to the shop floor and took his toolbox off the shelf where it had sat for 41 years, and he packed up his calipers and his feeler gauges and the little worn notebook where he wrote down, in his cramped, tight handwriting, everything turbine number 3 had ever done or ever might do. Henry Vaughan watched him from across the shop with a stricken look and did not know what to say. At 11:15 in the morning, Walter Kowalski walked out the main gate of the Monongahela River generating station with a cardboard box under his arm, and he drove home in his old Ford pickup along the river road with the water grey and slow beside him. He did not tell Margaret about the hesitation he had heard in the rotor. He was not their millwright anymore. It was not any longer his to say. 6 weeks passed. The first 2 weeks Walter did not know what to do with himself. He got up at 4:30 every morning the way he had for 4 decades, because a body will not unlearn 41 years in 14 days, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark drinking coffee and listening to the freight trains down along the river, and there was nothing that needed him. Margaret, who had spent 38 years managing hospital records at Mercy over in Oakland and had retired the year before, watched him from across the table with a quiet concern she did not put into words. She had seen this before in her own father, a machinist laid off from J&L Steel in the 70s. She knew what happened to a certain kind of man when the thing he did for a living was taken away from him before he was ready to set it down. By the 3rd week, Walter had cleaned the garage twice, rebuilt the carburetor on the old Ford for no good reason, and started walking down to the diner on Carson Street in the mornings to have his coffee somewhere that at least had other people in it. He read the paper cover to cover. He watched the river. He did not talk much about the plant, and Margaret did not push him, and neither of them said out loud what they both knew, that a piece of him had gone out that main gate with the cardboard box and had not, so far, come back. Henry Vaughan called on a Tuesday night at the end of the 5th week. Walter was at the kitchen table oiling a pair of pliers he did not need to oil. Margaret handed him the phone with an eyebrow raised, and he pressed it to his ear and said, "Henry." "Walt." Henry's voice was tight. "You sitting down?" "I'm sitting." "Turbine 3's been down 8 days." Walter went very still. Margaret, watching his face, set her own coffee cup down without a sound. "Down how?" Walter said. "Down like it won't stay up. They fire her, she runs about 40 minutes, and then the vibration alarms trip and the interlocks pull her offline. They've had her apart twice. Bearings, seals, alignment, everything checks. Brenner's had that outfit from Cincinnati in, the AI sensor people, 3 of them in matching polo shirts, and they've been running their algorithm for 6 days straight, and it keeps flagging a bearing failure that ain't there." Henry paused. "You want to know what it's costing? Tell me." $1 million a day, Walt, give or take, between the replacement power they're buying off the grid to cover their contracts and the penalty clauses in the industrial supply deals. $1 million a day. 8 days now. Walter did the math without meaning to. $8 million. It was a number so large it stopped meaning anything and became just a shape in the mind. He thought about Douglas Brenner's pressed white shirt and about the phrase not aligned with where the facility is going, and he did not feel satisfaction. What he felt was something more complicated, a low, steady sadness mostly, for the machine that he could hear even now in his head. Its slow, patient hum interrupted at the top of the stroke. "You told them?" Walter asked. "Told them what?" "Told them to call me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Henry spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, and there was something almost ashamed in it. "I told them, Walt. First day. Second day I told them again. I said to Brenner directly, said, Walter Kowalski worked that machine for 41 years. He'll tell you in an hour what your algorithm can't tell you in a month. And Brenner looked at me like I'd suggested we call in a fortune teller. He said, Henry paused, and then he said it flatly. The way you deliver bad news you've been rehearsing. He said the age of asking retired guys to come save the day is over. Said if their platform can't diagnose it, then it's a genuinely novel failure mode, and they need to solve it with modern tools. Said calling you back would be, his word, Walt, regressive. Walter listened. He did not answer for a while. Margaret was watching him from across the table, and her mouth had gone into a thin, straight line that he knew from 39 years of marriage meant she was angry on his behalf and holding it in for his sake. Well, Walter said finally, then I guess he'll solve it with his modern tools. Walt, Henry, I'm not their millwright. He made that clear. It's not my machine. It's going to be somebody's machine, Walt. If they can't fix her, they'll shut her down permanent. That's 140 jobs. That's me and Petrosky and the boys in the boiler house and the whole night crew. That's the plant, Walt. They shut 3 down for good. The load balance won't carry the other 2 units, and Meridian will find some reason to mothball the whole facility inside a year. You know it as well as I do. Walter closed his eyes. He had known Henry Vaughan since 1987, when Henry had come on as a green kid of 19, and Walter, only a few years older himself, had taught him how to read a vibration analyzer. He thought about the boiler house crew, most of them men with families and mortgages and children in the community college. He thought about Linda Petrosky, the control room supervisor, who had been widowed young and was raising 2 boys on her own. They call me, Walter said quietly, or they don't. I'm not going down there on my own hook, Henry. I got some pride left. I know you do, Walt. I know. That's why I'm calling. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it any other way. And I wanted to say, for what it's worth, some of us are trying. Frank's been on the phone all week to Ellis, the VP over in Harrisburg, trying to make somebody upstairs see sense. Raymond Ellis? That's the one. Frank thinks he's got half a conscience, which by executive standards is close to a saint. Henry gave a short, unhappy laugh. We'll see. They talked for another few minutes about nothing much, and Walter hung up and set the phone down on the kitchen table and did not move. Margaret got up quietly and refilled his coffee cup and set it in front of him and sat down again without a word. Outside, a train was going by on the tracks along the river, its horn low and long and lonesome in the winter night, and Walter Kowalski sat with his hands wrapped around the warm mug and thought about a machine 3 floors underground, 22 miles away, that was trying, in its patient mechanical way, to tell someone what was wrong with it, and about a young man in a pressed white shirt who had decided the machine was not worth listening to. The call from Raymond Ellis came 2 days later, on a Thursday morning at 9:10. Raymond Ellis was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, with a full head of graying hair combed straight back and the kind of tired eyes that came from 25 years of running plants and reading balance sheets. He had come up through operations himself, had started as a shift engineer at a coal plant in West Virginia in the 90s, before the MBA people had taken over, and he was the one senior executive at Keystone Meridian Energy who could still tell the difference between a bearing and a bushing. He drove down from Harrisburg himself and arrived at Walter's front door on Carson Street at 9:10 on that Thursday morning with a manila folder under his arm and the look of a man who had not slept a great deal in the past few nights. Margaret let him in. She offered him coffee and he accepted, and he sat at the kitchen table across from Walter and got right to it. Mr. Kowalski, Ellis said, I know how you left the plant. I know what was said to you and how it was said. I read the exit paperwork on my flight down last week, and I want to tell you plainly, before I say anything else, that the way you were separated was not how I would have done it if the decision had crossed my desk. It did not cross my desk. That's on me. And I'm sorry for it. Walter watched him and said nothing. I'm also not going to insult you by pretending this is a courtesy call. Turbine 3 has been offline for 10 days. We are burning through $1 million a day in replacement power and contract penalties. My engineers, my sensor vendor, and my consulting firm have collectively spent 48 person days on the diagnosis, and they cannot tell me what is wrong with the machine. Frank Delaney has told me, and Henry Vaughan has told me, and I now believe them both, that you can. So I am here to ask you, as a favor to me personally, and to the men and women whose jobs depend on that facility, to come back for one day and take a look." Walter looked down at his coffee. He turned the cup a slow quarter turn on the table. Margaret was standing at the counter behind Ellis with her arms folded, and Walter did not need to look at her to know exactly what her face was doing. "Mr. Ellis," Walter said finally, "I appreciate you coming down here in person. I do, but I'm not sitting here holding a grudge. I'm not going to say no because Douglas Brenner hurt my feelings. My feelings aren't the issue. What's the issue is that I was told by that man in front of my union rep that a lifetime of listening to that machine wasn't worth anything to your company. Now your company's out $8–10 million, and suddenly it's worth something again. That's a hard thing to swallow." Ellis nodded slowly. He had evidently been prepared for something like this. "You're right," he said. "You're entirely right, and I won't argue any of it. So let me offer you something different." He opened the folder. "Consulting contract. Independent. You work for you, not for us. Full day rate, $2,500. No obligation to fix anything, no obligation to explain anything you don't want to explain. If you come down and walk the floor and tell us what you hear, and we're able to use it, that's $2,500. If you come down and tell us to go to hell, that's still $2,500. Your call, and whatever you find or don't find. Douglas Brenner will personally walk you into that turbine hall in front of every engineer he's got on staff. That is a condition I will enforce, because I think, and this is my own view, not a company view, that a man ought to be respected in the room where his knowledge is being asked for." Walter looked at him for a long time. Margaret, behind Ellis, had unfolded her arms. "You'd make him do that," Walter said. "I would make him do that." Walter turned the coffee cup another quarter turn. He was thinking about Linda Petrosky, and about Henry, and about the boys in the boiler house. He was thinking about his father, who had gone back to Homestead as a subcontractor twice after he was laid off, because there had been mortgages and children and a wife who needed the medical, and had told Walter once, sitting on this same porch on a summer night in 1994, "Pride is a good thing to have, son, but it don't feed anybody, and it don't keep a plant running. You do the work if the work needs doing. You just don't ever let 'em tell you the work don't matter." "All right," Walter said. His voice was quiet and level, the same voice he had used in the conference room 6 weeks earlier. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, I bring my own tools. I walk where I want. I talk to whoever I want. And when I'm done, whether I found anything or not, I walk out that gate on my own 2 feet, and Douglas Brenner doesn't say one word to me on the way out. That's the deal." "That's the deal," Ellis said. They shook hands. Ellis finished his coffee, thanked Margaret, and let himself out. When the door closed, Walter sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving, staring at the manila folder Ellis had left behind. Margaret came around and sat down across from him, and reached out and put her hand over his. "You didn't have to say yes," she said. "I know I didn't." "Then why did you?" Walter thought about how to answer her. He thought about the phrase carrying redundant labor, and about Henry's voice on the phone saying that's me and Petrosky and the boys in the boiler house, and about a machine 3 floors underground trying to tell someone what was wrong with it. Outside, the winter sun was climbing up over the roofs across the street and lighting the frost on the front windows. "Because the machine didn't do anything wrong," Walter said finally. "The machine's just sitting down there sick, and there's nobody left in that building who speaks its language. If I don't go, it doesn't get well." Margaret's eyes were bright. She squeezed his hand hard once, and then let go, and got up to pour him another cup of coffee, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The next morning, at 6:45, in the grey cold light of a January dawn, Walter Kowalski put his toolbox in the passenger seat of the old Ford, drove 22 miles along the frozen river road to the front gate of the Monongahela River Generating Station, and walked back onto the plant floor for the first time in 6 weeks, with his shoulders square and his notebook in his breast pocket and his boots ringing on the concrete he had walked for 4 decades. Douglas Brenner was waiting at the doors of the turbine hall in a pressed white shirt and khakis, with an expression that suggested he had swallowed something bitter. He did not speak. He held the door open, and Walter walked past him without a glance, and he went down the 3 flights of steel stairs to the turbine floor where the great cold silent shape of number 3 was waiting for him. And he set his toolbox down, and he stood very still with his hand on the housing, and he listened. He listened for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. Douglas Brenner and 3 of his engineers stood on the catwalk above, and Raymond Ellis stood with them, and none of them said a word. Linda Petrosky had come over from the control room and was standing at the far end of the turbine floor with her arms folded. Henry Vaughan leaned against a support column with his cap in his hand and a small pleased look on his face he was trying to keep hidden. The Cincinnati sensor consultants, all 3 of them in matching polo shirts, stood in a tight, uncomfortable knot near the diagnostic cart. The turbine hall was cold and echoing, and the only sound was the distant hum of Units 1 and 2 working somewhere elsewhere in the building. Walter did not touch the diagnostic equipment. He did not open his toolbox. He walked slowly around the great cold housing of turbine number 3, running his palm along the casing here and there, stopping at the bearing pedestals, laying his cheek against the metal at one point and closing his eyes. He climbed up onto the platform and looked down the length of the exposed shaft, where the maintenance crews had opened the machine for the 4th time in 10 days. He crouched down and looked underneath. He stood up and walked around to the low-pressure end and stood staring at the coupling for a long time. Then he came back to the front of the machine and opened his little notebook, and he read something in it that he had written a long time ago. And then he closed the notebook and put it back in his breast pocket and looked up at Douglas Brenner on the catwalk. "Fire her up," Walter said. Brenner glanced at Ellis. Ellis nodded once. Brenner keyed his radio. "Petrosky, start sequence on 3. Linda Petrosky moved to a wall panel and lifted a phone and gave the order. Somewhere far away in the boiler house, valves opened and steam began to move, and the great machine came alive under Walter's hand. First with a shudder that ran through his boots, then with the slow gathering hum he had known for 4 decades, climbing up through the octaves as the rotor came up to speed. Walter had one hand on the housing and one hand on the bearing pedestal at the number 2 position. His eyes were closed. She ran clean for 20 minutes, then 30. The Cincinnati consultants started to look at each other. One of Brenner's engineers said something under his breath. At 34 minutes, Walter said very quietly, without opening his eyes, "There it is." Nobody else had heard anything. "Trip her," Walter said. Petrosky did. The turbine wound down, the hum sliding back down the octaves and dying, and the hall went silent again. Walter opened his eyes and turned to look up at the catwalk. And he was not smiling, but there was something in his face that had not been there before. "Governor Pedestal," Walter said, addressing himself to no one in particular. "Number 2 lube feed. I want the cover pulled." The senior of Brenner's engineers, a competent-looking man in his 40s named Kellerman, said, "We've had that pedestal open twice. Bearings are within spec. Alignment is within spec. Everything on that assembly reads clean." "I know it does," Walter said. "Pull the cover, please." 2 of the maintenance techs went to work. Brenner came down off the catwalk. He stood off to one side with his arms folded, and he did not look at Walter, and Walter did not look at him. Ellis had come down too, and he was watching Walter with an expression that was somewhere between hope and something older and more complicated. When the cover was off, Walter went up onto the platform and took a small flashlight out of his coveralls pocket and got down on one knee and reached into the pedestal assembly with his other hand. His weathered fingers moved with a slow familiarity along the interior of the housing, feeling for something. He stopped. He held very still. "Kellerman," Walter said, "hand me a magnet on a stick. Long one. And a shop rag." Kellerman did. Walter reached in with the magnetized rod, moved it in a slow, careful arc through the oil at the bottom of the reservoir, and then drew it out and wiped it on the shop rag. There, on the grey cloth in the pale yellow worklight, sat something so small that at first Brenner from 10 feet away could not tell what it was. It was a washer. A flat steel washer, about the size of a nickel, badly deformed, one edge crushed and folded, the other edge scored bright silver where it had been scraping against something moving very fast, over and over, for a very long time. Walter stood up slowly, one hand on his lower back. He walked to the edge of the platform and held the shop rag out flat on his palm, so that Douglas Brenner and Raymond Ellis and the three men from Cincinnati and everyone else standing in the turbine hall could see the small deformed piece of metal sitting there in the light. Number 2 Governor Lube feed, Walter said, has a small oil deflector plate up inside the housing, held on by 4 washers and 4 bolts. That's a piece of one of them. It sheared off, my guess is during that hard trip you had at Thanksgiving, when the grid went unstable and you had to ramp down fast, and it fell into the oil bath, and it's been sitting down at the bottom of the reservoir ever since. Every time you spin up to full load, the oil circulation catches it and cycles it up into the bearing pack, and it interferes with the lube film at the top of the stroke, and you get that vibration signature your algorithm's been reading as a bearing failure. It's not a bearing failure, it's a foreign object. Been there since November. He held the rag out a moment longer. Piece like that, from a Midwest fastener catalog, runs about $4. There was a silence in the turbine hall so complete you could hear the boilers 3 rooms away. Douglas Brenner's face had gone the color of concrete. He stared at the washer and then at Walter, and his mouth opened and closed once, and no sound came out. Raymond Ellis let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He looked at Brenner. He looked at Kellerman. He looked at the 3 men from Cincinnati. "Get it out," Ellis said quietly. "Replace the deflector plate. Full lube system flush. I want her back on the grid tonight." Then he turned to Walter, and he held out his hand, and Walter shifted the shop rag to his left hand, and took Ellis's hand with his right, and they shook once, firmly, without ceremony. "Mr. Kowalski," Ellis said. "Thank you." Walter nodded. He climbed down off the platform. He picked up his toolbox. He walked past Douglas Brenner without looking at him, and he headed up the 3 flights of steel stairs toward the daylight, and behind him a room full of engineers and consultants and mechanics stood in silence, staring at a $4 washer sitting in a shop rag on the deck plate, worth in that moment exactly $11 million, the price of the 10 days of lost power and the 4 days still to come. And something else besides, something that could not be put in dollars at all, that had to do with what a man is, and what a man knows, and what it costs to pretend otherwise. Henry Vaughan was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He said nothing as Walter came past. He just reached out and squeezed Walter's shoulder once, and Walter nodded to him, and kept walking up toward the light. Walter Kowalski did not go back to the plant after that day. The turbine came back on the grid at 10 minutes past 9 that evening. Henry called Margaret's phone from the shop floor to tell them, his voice thick with something very close to triumph. And by dawn, number 3 was running clean at 98% load, with a vibration signature so smooth that the Cincinnati consultants, before they packed up and drove back to Ohio, admitted quietly to Kellerman that they had never seen a diagnosis like it. The $4 washer sat, cleaned and dried, in a small clear plastic case on Raymond Ellis's desk in Harrisburg, where it remained for the rest of his career, and where he sometimes pointed to it during meetings when a younger executive started talking about redundancy in a tone Ellis did not care for. Walter drove home that afternoon, along the same river road he had driven 6 weeks earlier with the cardboard box. The water was still grey, still slow, but something in the cab of the old Ford had shifted, and he felt it as clearly as he had felt anything in his life. It was not vindication. It was not satisfaction. It was something older and quieter than either of those things, the simple, settled peace of a man who had done the work that needed doing, and had done it in his own way, and had not paid too much for it in the currency of his own soul. Margaret was waiting on the front porch when he pulled into the driveway. He got out of the truck stiff-legged, and she came down the steps and wrapped both arms around him without saying anything at all, and they stood like that in the cold for a long minute. And then she took his hand and led him inside. Douglas Brenner was gone from the plant inside 3 months. The company did not announce it as a firing. He was reassigned, the memo said, to a strategic advisory role at corporate. Everyone at the plant knew what that meant. Henry, who told Walter about it over coffee at the Carson Street diner one morning in April, said that Ellis had done it quietly and cleanly, and that Brenner had not been given the opportunity to argue. What everyone at the plant came eventually to know was that Raymond Ellis had ordered a full audit of every recent restructuring Brenner had overseen, and that 6 of the 7 consolidated senior maintenance positions were quietly restored to the roster over the following year, along with a formal policy, Ellis's own, written by his hand, that no senior technician with more than 20 years of service could be separated from a Keystone Meridian facility without a documented consultation with plant operations leadership and the local union steward. Frank Delaney kept a framed copy of it on the wall of the Union Hall. He called it, without irony, the Kowalski Rule. The Cincinnati sensor consultants lost their contract that spring. Their platform stayed, in a diminished capacity, as one input among several. But the maintenance division was rebuilt around what Ellis, in the memo, called integrated craft expertise, a phrase that meant, in plain English, that the old millwrights would be listened to again, and that a machine's own voice would count for at least as much as an algorithm's opinion of it. Kellerman made a habit that year of driving down to Carson Street once a month with a six-pack and a list of questions. Walter did not go back on the payroll. Ellis offered handsomely, and Walter thanked him and turned it down. He had, he said, retired. He had a fishing cabin to think about, and a wife who deserved to have him in the house, but he did agree at Ellis's request to come in one day a year, the third Thursday in October always, to walk the turbine hall with the senior mechanics, and to listen to the three great machines, and to write down in his notebook whatever they told him. He did it every year for 8 years, until his knees would not carry him down the 3 flights of steel stairs anymore. He never took a dollar for any of it after that first day. When Ellis pressed him once, gently, Walter said only, "I already got paid for that machine, Ray. 41 years' worth. The rest is just keeping her company." Here was the thing that surprised him most in the years that followed. Not the vindication and not the restoration of the maintenance jobs, and not even the Kowalski Rule with his name on it hanging in the Union Hall. What surprised him was Linda Petrosky, who came by the house one Saturday morning 3 months after the washer, with a foil-covered dish of stuffed cabbage from her mother's recipe and a young man of about 17 at her side, who was, she explained a little shyly, her older boy, and who had been thinking he might want to be a millwright someday. And could he please, if it wasn't too much trouble, ask Mr. Kowalski some questions? Walter took the young man out to the garage and sat him down and started, without meaning to and without ceremony, to teach him the things his own father had taught him 50 years before. The boy came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and in due course became one of the finest young mechanics on the Monongahela plant floor, and named his own son Walter, and never once forgot where he had learned his trade. That was what surprised Walter in the end. Not what the washer had cost the company, or what it had won back for him, but that a small, quiet act of listening, of showing up when asked, of doing the work in his own way and refusing to accept the story other men had tried to tell about the worth of that work, had turned out to reach forward through years and touch lives he had never expected to touch. His grandfather had said once, in Polish, that the true measure of a man was not what he built with his hands, but what he built in the hands of others. Walter had not understood the saying until he was well past 60. He understood it now. He lived to be 79. He and Margaret got the fishing cabin. He passed one October afternoon in an armchair by the window in the Carson Street house, with a cup of coffee cooling on the sill beside him and the low, steady sound of a freight train coming up from the river, and a young mechanic named Walter Petrosky sitting on the couch across from him, listening to a story about a turbine and a washer and a young man in a pressed white shirt who had thought the work did not matter. When the story was done, the old man closed his eyes to rest them for a moment and did not open them again, and the young man sat with him in the quiet room until the light went, and then went out and made the necessary calls. They kept the $4 washer all those years in the plastic case on the executive's desk in Harrisburg. But the real thing Walter Kowalski left behind was not the washer at all. It was the plain, quiet lesson his whole life had taught. That there is a knowing that does not come out of any school, and a dignity that does not come off any organizational chart, and that a man who has spent his life listening patiently to something, year after year, will hear at last what no algorithm can hear, and that the world would do well, if it wants to keep running, to make room at its table for such men, and to listen when they speak.